everyone, I'm Drew, and sometimes I play games. Today, I'm looking at one of the titans of the 90s arcade racing scene, San Francisco Rush Extreme Racing. If you don't remember or weren't around at the time, the mid-90s was kind of a golden age of arcade racing games. Those huge garish cabinets were tucked away in every major store and restaurant, their bright lights and vivid colors calling out like a siren song to every child in the establishment. The machines eager to desperately gulp down every quarter in their parents' purses. There was a seemingly endless, rotating lineup of games everywhere you went, but in the back half of the decade, there seemed to be two cabinets that were a staple in every business you visited: Area 51 and San Francisco Rush. I had no idea why Rush was so prolific until I was doing research for this video, and honestly, I didn't care. All I cared about was how rad it was to launch that chunky bus into the stratosphere over the zero-G hills of San Francisco. During my exhaustive investigation though, I learned that those majestic radioactive green cabinets spread like COVID across the nation, not because of the inherent quality of the game or its ability to draw in players, although it certainly had both of those things going for it, but instead through harnessing the raw power of unfettered capitalism.
You just got
capitalism.
It turns out, San Francisco Rush was one of the earlier arcade games to be built around the 3DFX Voodoo graphics chip rather than proprietary systems, which allowed the developers to do some new fancy 3D effects, but it also made the game cheaper to develop and therefore cheaper to sell. Because of this, Atari was able to undercut the price of its competitors and brute force itself into damn near every building in America, from Walmart and Hills all the way down to Burt's Discount Ammo and Liquor. Aside from staging a coup on the waiting for your parents to finish grocery shopping market, Rush brought some interesting ideas to the table and added its own flavor to the arcade racing genre too. The most immediately striking thing was, of course, that airtime. Rush seemed to operate in a universe where Isaac Newton never discovered the theory of gravity, and so it was treated as if it didn't exist. The smallest elevation changes would make you detach from the Earth and lazily float across the streets. The bigger jumps would launch you into low Earth orbit, and the game generously peppered its courses with the latter. In stark contrast to this, and despite how little time you spent there, the on-road physics felt surprisingly heavy and, well, grounded, at least relative to its contemporaries. The course design was pretty clever too, with an abundance of alternate routes and shortcuts which all led to a largely warm reception upon release, where San Francisco Rush was praised for its innovative track design and realistic driving physics by critics who had presumably never driven or seen a car in real life.
Just move your car! Okay, I don't know how I can! Oh my god, just grab the steering wheel! Fine!
The game also received a pretty impressive and substantial console port onto the Nintendo 64 and a significantly less impressive port onto the PlayStation 1. The N64 version is where I spent the vast majority of my time with the game, and that's the version I'll be talking about today. So let's jump into it. The Nintendo 64 version of San Francisco Rush was developed and published by Midway on November 8, 1997. This was a pretty faithful translation of the original that did a great job of bringing the feel and spirit of the arcade game to a home console, while fleshing out and expanding the content for the home market with mixed success. In my last video, which I released last month, oh my god, that was 3 years ago? What the f am I even doing with my life? I talked about Gran Turismo. And if playing that game in 2020 felt familiar but somewhat dated, then San Francisco Rush feels completely alien, like digging up a relic of a civilization long extinct. This is a game that exists in a weird, specific niche that's nearly non-existent now. It's a capital A arcade racer, complete with a timer that's refilled by hitting checkpoints and a practically non-existent progression system. At the same time, while the gameplay is over the top with airtime that approaches Ace Combat levels, it still respects the limitations of its cars more than a typical arcade racer. On the road, it can take a colossal effort to wrestle the cars through turns, and they're prone to losing control on fast directional changes or collisions. In the air, they carry whatever momentum was applied to them on takeoff, spinning, rolling, and careening out of control in a natural way, and that inevitable return to Earth is a monumental event as the cars violently reconnect with the asphalt, bouncing, spinning, sparking, and every once in a blue moon, continuing to drive in the direction you want. There's none of the overly artificial hand-holding that turns me off of a lot of arcade racers, and it lends a tactile feel to the physics, like the cars actually exist in the game's world, and interact with it in believable ways. It's also a relatively slow-paced affair. Your speedometer shows some big numbers, but they never quite match up to what's happening on screen. The game may tell you that you're doing 150 through the city streets, but the sense of speed says you're going about half that. To be clear, this is not a bad thing, and the more deliberate pace contributes a lot to the unique feel of Rush and helps to further separate it from its rivals. The combination of these relatively unique factors lend the game a sense of cohesion, which led critics to praise the driving physics as realistic some 25 years ago. While cars may not adhere to the rules of our reality, they behave in a way that feels natural with the rules set out in Rush's reality. It doesn't always work, and in fact, playing the game can occasionally feel frustrating today, but Rush had, and still has, an undeniably unique feel to it. Looking at it through a modern lens makes any assertions of realism seem laughable. The weighty ground physics are seemingly achieved by making every car understeer like it's driven by a Honda bro who forgot to reattach the steering wheel before racing. It was like they accurately modeled the handling physics of the bus and said, "Great work guys, we did it," then copy-pasted that to every other car in the game and called it a day. If you're used to playing a game where tire grip is a thing that exists, it can be pretty hard to adjust to the world of Rush, where steering inputs feel like a suggestion that your car will almost always ignore. But with enough time, it is possible to settle into the game's rhythm and beat the driving physics into something resembling submission. In fairness, it's easy to be facetious after 25 years of technology advancements, but the dev team did approach the game as a simulation, at least to some extent. According to a developer retrospective originally published in Game Developer magazine in 1998, the underlying physics model is based on hard driving, one of the early pioneers of 3D driving simulation. This model simulated the engine and its effects on the wheels and thus the tire patches, in addition to tracking the reciprocal forces back up through the drivetrain. Although this sounds well and good, it doesn't necessarily come through in the gameplay, especially in the console releases which lack the force feedback steering wheel setup of the arcade. Nevertheless, the driving model does feel notably more complex and nuanced than a lot of its arcade contemporaries like Cruisin' USA. And once you do get a feel for the driving physics, it's time to tackle the flying physics, which are both more temperamental and infinitely more rewarding. What makes the jumps and airtime so intoxicating is the consequence of choice. You're given the freedom to make mistakes, and the mistakes are punished harshly. The successful jumps are heart-stopping moments of anticipation as you hope and pray for the landing to be as clean as the takeoff. The bad ones are what feels like 30 agonizing seconds of reaping what you've sown in slow motion and low gravity. You soar through the air towards certain death, helplessly praying for a savior that never comes before the ground finally reaches back up and smites you down for the reckless arrogance with which you decided to send it. And when that smiting does happen, you're treated to some of the most okayest visual spectacle that 1997 has to offer. I suppose I should spend a little time on the graphics, but frankly, even at the time, I never thought of Rush as a visual powerhouse. The game does have a recognizable aesthetic with bold, chunky models and bright, vivid colors, but the look of the game in general just kinda does what it needs to, no more and no less. It's very much the quintessential Nintendo 64 look with huge, bulky geography, Silent Hill level draw distance, and barely existent textures. If you've been just listening to this video instead of watching, just imagine you asked an AI art generator to create a Nintendo 64 racing game with no other information, and you'll be 90% of the way there. That said, the look does work for the game and does a passable enough job bringing the arcade version home, which itself looked great for the time, but looking back has an almost HD N64 aesthetic to it, sharing the same propensity for bold, chunky designs, which lent themselves remarkably well to being downgraded for a home console. The arcade version of Rush shipped with 3 tracks and 4 cars. Not a huge amount, but not entirely unusual for a mid-90s arcade cabinet either. There was an updated version of the game released in 1997 dubbed San Francisco Rush The Rock Alcatraz Edition, which was developed contemporaneously with the N64 port. This was essentially a version 1.5 of the game, featuring an additional 4 tracks and 4 cars, more than doubling the content of the original. Most of this made its way into the console version, although one of the tracks was hidden away and only accessible as cheat codes, which was a questionable decision that I'll come back to in a bit. In addition to the arcade-style single race option, there's also a sort of but not really career mode in the form of circuit races, and a sort of but not really free roaming mode in the form of practice races. And those couple sort of but not reallys hint at a core problem with San Francisco Rush. There's just not much to do. The developers definitely seemed to be aware of this and took measures to alleviate the issue, but they weren't entirely successful, and in some cases, actually made the problem worse. 6 tracks is just not a lot of content, no matter how well designed they are. To get around this, they added reversed and mirrored variants of each course. The reverse versions are fine. Running tracks backwards is a long-running tradition in racing games, and it can give new context to familiar environments. It works better on the new tracks than the originals, which were clearly not designed with the reverse layout in mind. The new tracks actually have some interesting wrinkles though, particularly on track 4 where one of the alternate routes becomes the main route when run backwards. The mirrored versions of the tracks just come across as padding though, and hilariously low effort padding at that. Not only is track 2 but you're now turning right instead of left an intrinsically uninteresting concept, but it's handled with the absolute bare minimum who gives a shit amount of effort too. It looks like they took the entire track model and flipped it horizontally, which has the horrifying effect of reversing all the text and making it look like you're racing through a world occupied by a Lovecraftian doom cult intent on awakening Azathoth, the blind idiot god, and ending this hellish nightmare of reality once and for all. And what's worse, the padding actually damages the entire game by its mere existence, because the absolute slog of a sort of but not really career mode makes you run every variation of every track. So that's forward, reverse, forward mirrored, and reverse mirrored. This means you'll spend more time on the bad versions of the tracks than you will on the good ones. It's a weird situation where a game that's already pretty light on content would have been better with even less content. What's more, there was even a partial solution tucked away in the corner and hidden behind a cheat code, in the form of that secret Alcatraz track. It's not entirely clear based on my research why Alcatraz, which was the big showpiece of the arcade game and would become almost the face of the series, didn't quite make the cut. My best guess is that the console team just didn't have enough time to fully finish the track before release, and well, DLC wasn't quite a thing yet. The version that's present here does feel somewhat incomplete compared to both the arcade version and the track that would later appear in the sequel, but the bones are there. All the elements that define a classic Rush track are present and accounted for. The big elevation changes, the giant bank turns, the tempting but dangerous alternate routes. Even with less polish than the base tracks, it's still a damn solid track and a lot more fun to drive than the bad versions of the base tracks that the game would rather force you onto. And it's a shame because the good versions of the tracks are really good. The game definitely knows where its strengths lie as far as driving physics, and it makes great use of elevation changes. It also toys with your expectations in fun and devious ways, hiding sharp, near-blind turns behind huge tempting hills in an effort to catch you off guard and make you jump your car into the living room of Aunt Janice's 8th-story apartment. Track 6 also has an interesting layout. It's essentially 2 small independent courses separated by a long straight highway run, almost like the road course version of Unreal Tournament's 2 towers. It's not immediately clear which direction you're supposed to drive the end courses, which confused me at first, but then I realized that while there is a correct route depending on which configuration you're running, you can actually take them either way, which is a super cool idea. It makes for some exciting situations where you're driving through head-on traffic composed of other racers. The downside is that if you crash, you'll be reset to the proper route and lose a fair bit of time. I was generally faster on the forward route, so I would take it regardless of which version of the track I was running, which made for some exciting risk versus reward decision making. It doesn't necessarily feel like this was an intentional decision by the developers, but it's definitely a happy accident that would make Bob Ross proud.
God was really having a good day when he made it.
In fact, those risk versus reward decisions are a constant presence in the game thanks to the abundance of alternate routes and shortcuts. Every track is littered with side streets, back alleys, and conspicuously placed jumps that will send you all over the damn place. You'll veer through parking lots, skip across rooftops, and roll to a fiery death in the sewers that you always knew your life was destined for. These offshoots can lead back to the track, of course, but they're just as likely to lead to a dead end, a hidden key, or an entire secret area. They're just great. They're smartly designed, bursting with creative energy, and integrated into the world in a way that feels natural. They're so pervasive that they give the game an almost open world feel, where you head into practice mode to explore all the nooks and crannies and try to map out the fastest path through the tracks. And even once you have worked out the quickest route through a track, actually hitting it is another deal entirely. Not all of the shortcuts are faster, but they're almost universally really freaking dangerous, to the point that actually getting through one properly can feel like trying to nail that perfect line on Skate 3. It's a constant game of measuring risk versus reward, and of trying to decide just how much confidence you have in your ability to keep the rubber side down and the front side forward. The frustration of failing to do so just makes it all the more satisfying when you actually manage it. All of this adds up to one of the brightest spots in the Nintendo 64's admittedly pretty sparse racing catalog. Rush was not the most accessible racing game even in its day, and it's become even less so with the passage of time, but it remains a genuinely interesting and engaging racing game that, strangely enough, seems to have left absolutely no impact on the gaming landscape. The arcade racing genre as a whole has largely fallen out of style, and this specific variant of it has almost completely disappeared. Racing games in the AAA space are few and far between these days, with only Gran Turismo and Forza really holding out. Even Need for Speed, one of the longest running and highest profile driving games, and a decades-long fixture in the arcade but not completely over the top space, is almost being treated like EA is embarrassed by it, with the last title sneaking onto shelves with hardly any marketing or support, despite being, by all accounts, a refreshingly solid game. The only game truly carrying the torch for arcade racing these days is Forza Horizon. But while there's a lot to appreciate about that series, it doesn't really bear much of a resemblance to what would have been considered an arcade racing game even 10 years ago. I could draw some sort of strained connection from San Francisco Rush to Horizon in the form of semi-plausible ground physics and plenty of big jumps or whatever, but frankly, that much of a stretch would be irresponsible, and I don't think my brittle old man joints could handle it. For all Horizon does right, and that's a pretty extensive list, it's also a modern open-world AAA game through and through. That is, the structure and DNA share more in common with generic Ubisoft open world 06 than the no-frills circuit racers of years past. Which is not a slight against the series at all, but it does scratch a different itch than a game like San Francisco Rush. If you look outside the mainstream, there have been some attempts to bring back a bit of that original arcade spirit, and in particular, there seemed to be a small revival bubbling up a couple years ago when Hotshot Racing and Inertial Drift released right next to each other and both flirted with mainstream attention, but that sort of fizzled out before it really got started. There's still a small trickle of retro-inspired indie arcade racers, but even with those, Rush never seems to be an obvious inspiration. Outside of the couple sequels it got, it weirdly never really seemed to penetrate the greater gaming culture or make any kind of significant waves, despite being a big success in arcades and being generally well regarded at home. More than 2 decades later, it remains a surprisingly singular experience that was never truly expanded or built on in the way that it arguably deserved. Which is a shame, because Rush really was something special. Even playing it today, just a few years shy of its 30th birthday, Rush has a cohesive, engaging, and satisfying feel that not many racing games can match. It's honestly a little odd to me that no kind of reboot, revival, or even spiritual successor has managed to pop up and gain any sort of traction. Although I haven't done extensive research, my understanding is that the license itself is floating around in some kind of capitalist purgatory after Midway's bankruptcy in 2010, and given the lack of excitement around the franchise, it's not likely that anyone is really itching to put the resources into untangling the legal mess to rescue it. Given the passage of enough time, anything's possible, as is evident by the fact that I'm finally able to suck at GoldenEye on a Microsoft console, but for the time being, San Francisco Rush is relegated to being a relic of times past.
But how could such primitive people, living perhaps tens of thousands of years ago, have produced such flawless...
There's no way to play it today that doesn't involve emulators or decades-old hardware. It seems all but forgotten in the industry, and it's rarely mentioned even in retro gaming communities outside of the occasional poorly thought-out, rambling YouTube essay. It's a game that deserves better than the slow fade into obscurity that it's getting, but nothing ever truly disappears from the internet, and so even if that revival never happens, Rush will always be there as a time capsule, housing what was quietly one of the greatest racing games of all time.